Well, welcome to our December webinar on how culture shapes behavior to build more resilient organizations. I am Linda Nelson and I'll be your speaker today. Happy to have you here. We're going to be looking at culture and explore that from the perspectives of a strong culture, a high-performing culture, innovative, adaptive, and resilient. And one of the things that I hope that you see as an outcome is that each of these perspectives um, kind of filters into how to be a more resilient organization itself. The recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webinar page, usually by the end of the week. If you have questions, please use the questions button. I am on my own today, so questions will be answered after the webinar. And I do have to apologize if you attended our November webinar. We have been a bit short-staffed and a lot of people have been out sick. So if you haven't received your November webinar yet, or certificate, you will. And we will have the certificate of attendance out for this webinar as well, as long as you attend a minimum of 35 minutes. So one of the things I just wanted to share, and kind of as a starting spot for where we're going, is understanding that the cornerstone of any organizational resilience strategy is the organization's culture. And this is where we need to start. And we've talked about culture, we've talked about risk culture, we've talked about, individual purpose this year. We've talked about a lot of things. And they all really get tied back to culture. And so having a more resilient organization requires a commitment. And it's really dependent upon the existence of this idea of shared beliefs and values, having positive attitudes as well as behaviors. And this is going to lead into really our next year's series of webinars, which are all going to be and I'll talk more about that at the end today, but they're all going to be focusing on the behavior side of things. And so as behaviors is how you behave and how they express your organization's culture, we wanted to end the year with this topic so that we could begin next year by talking about what are those specific behaviors. Because culture provides a sense of identity to its people, it also reinforces the values of the organizations, and as such, it serves as a control mechanism for shaping behaviors. So we're going to look at the cultural attributes from these different perspectives that are visible in more resilient organizations, and what leaders, and I just want to remind you that no matter what your job position, you are a leader and you're a future leader, and what you can do to foster a culture that supports your organization's vision and mission. So just a caveat here, I'm not promoting this book, but I think I might actually read it. I was more looking for a picture of what it is that we were talking about, but understanding that culture matters, and what separates the highest performing organizations from the rest is culture. And this is what enables that competitive advantage to sustain and grow over time. And that's why I kind of liked this, win from within concept here. So we have to understand that culture starts with what people do and also how they do it. We know that in any industry, what people do may not differ dramatically, but high-performing organizations distinguish themselves in how they do it. And that's why we're going to be talking, again, kind of launching to this behaviors piece next year. So this cumulative effect of what is done and how it is done ultimately determines your organization's performance. And this is the culture of this is what the underpinning is. But I don't want you to forget about the why people do what they do as well. So simply, culture is what you do, how you do it, and why you do it. And I know there's different definitions for culture, but I kind of liked looking at this approach very simply. So McKinsey had put out a study to talk about why culture matters. And we know that culture correlates with performance. And that's why obviously we're going to be talking about high performance cultures. But in their study, they found that companies with top quartile cultures posted a return to shareholders that was 60% higher than medium companies and 200% higher than those in the bottom quartile. So what they're saying, what separates them? It's your culture. And cultures, it's not like you can put a playbook together and you can't copy what someone else has. It's because every company is different, even within industries. It's made up of different people and what it is that you're trying to accomplish and your values and your purpose. And so the ultimate competitive advantage is a healthy culture that adapts automatically to changing conditions to find new ways to succeed. And I do want to caveat that by saying that I don't see anything that automatically adapts to anything. Um, you know, if I should say, because we're seeing so many changing conditions, a healthy culture is going to enable you to adapt more automatically, but it still has to be a purposeful activity. And having a healthy culture really enables organizations to adapt. So I guess to adapt. And they're saying that organizations with high performing cultures actually thrive on change. It's something that they embrace. And they're seeing that 70% of failed transformations are really due to culture related issues. So again, culture is important, culture has a place here, and we really need to be focusing on how we do things and how we can make sure that we don't have an unhealthy culture, because an unhealthy culture is really what leads to underperformance and what can cripple any size organization. So we know that an organization's culture governs how management, employees, and stakeholders behave, how they act, and how they perform their jobs. Culture is often also expressed in our self image and our inner workings and our future expectations with our role within that organization. Because as we talked about individual purpose back at the beginning of the year, how you identify yourselves within your organization is really important. And it's part of how it illustrates how a team can work towards achieving desired goals as well. So we need to be looking at individuals and teams and management and leadership as all part of this. One of the most common cries from leadership is, we want a strong company culture, because data says that strong company culture leads to more satisfied employees. And we know that satisfied employees overall outperform competitors by 20%, and that happy employees are more productive than those who dislike their positions. And I would argue that 12% is a small number. I would think it's bigger than that. Another study, an HR firm was saying, why do employees join your company? Well, 33% came because they liked your corporate culture. They like what your company stood for. But why do employees stay? And the 88% of them stay because of the corporate culture. And retention is one of the things that everyone is struggling with today more than in the past, with so many of our people leaving, for lots and lots of reasons, and we won't get into that today. But if you can keep people because of your corporate culture, you're going to win. So what is it we're actually talking about with a strong company culture? So we've got 7 kind of attributes of those that we wanted to talk about. One of those is your organization's stability itself. Even investors or lenders, they even want to work with more stable organizations or lend them money. They're always looking at your stability over time. But stability also provides employees and anybody else you work with security, and having that predictability, appreciating that predictability of your course of action. And here, when we've been faced with so much change, if you can keep as much of your organization stable as possible, it's going to reduce the anxiety. And so by having a stable environment, your employees will tend to care about the results and help you to really create that common purpose. And it helps to sustain that stability. So stability sustains stability, and it grows from each other. This attention to details was one I hadn't really considered before. And, this is from how you onboard your people to how you manage your shareholders' reports, for example. So looking at this idea that your corporate culture needs to pay attention to the small stuff. You've heard that before, pay attention to the small stuff and the big stuff will take care of itself. But having a passion for detail also demonstrates efficiency and a commitment to service. And they're saying that employees who pay more attention to the fine print or to the detail tend to be more productive as well. So you might think that that's, a paradox. Well, not really, because if somebody is paying attention too much to the nitty gritty, they're not as productive as just keep moving forward. But they're saying that because you're going to be more productive because of whatever you're producing is of higher quality as well. We're going to be talking about an innovative culture, but a strong company culture allows for innovation. And a strong company culture prioritizes innovation instead of that status quo. And innovation itself, we're going to talk a lot about that today. It involves experimentation, it involves risk taking, and the future success really depends on how well you innovate. Every goal-oriented business should make innovation part of their company culture. I don't see how you can't have it. How can your organization grow if you're not innovating? It's part of what keeps you in that competitive environment as well. And so again, I don't really care so much about the definitions of these different types of company cultures and what they call themselves. What I want you to see is what those attributes are and how that there's overlap between each of them. You need to be competitive in the marketplace. You can't possibly stay in business if you're not competitive. And so one of the things that they've really seen is a strong correlation between competitiveness and company performance. And so if competitiveness is tied to innovation, it's also going to be dependent on your attention to details and your stable environment. Obviously, the world has moved to more of a team orientation. This has been going on for years and years. But hiring a competent team or team member is one thing, but having the people work as a team is another concept altogether. And so we often see a lot of um, education out there about how to manage teams, how to get people to work together better. Because without a skilled workforce, I mean, no matter how skilled your workforce is, if you don't have good teamwork, the dream won't work, just to put a cliche out there. And so part of this team orientation means sharing a diverse set of skills and complementary roles. And so we know that diversity and inclusion and integration are all really huge aspects of more resilient organizations, and diversity of thought, not just, diversity of culture and some of the more prominent ones that we're hearing about today, but having a diverse set of skills that are in complementary roles and that they can collaborate together towards that common goal is a huge piece. So where team orientation might not seem like a big deal, all the parts that are part of it are. And your teams can't be successful and your people can't be successful unless your organization has an outcome orientation. And so this means you need to really have well-defined priorities. And leadership needs to define those desired outcomes. And as you're experiencing change in your organization, those outcomes might be changing. And so this is where that whole agile and adaptive piece comes in that, all right, because of these changes, our outcomes have kind of pivoted is the word that a lot of people are using. We've pivoted or shifted left, for example. And so understanding that, we need a team working towards particular outcomes because then they take ownership of that goal or project. And the more they take ownership, the better that project will turn out. And this is another attribute that I really liked and that you've maybe seen, different ways of describing it, but the supporting of each other. And this is where employee wellness comes into place, where you have an environment where listening and providing support to employees as well as all of its people is a value of how you operate. And when people feel like they're accepted and have some autonomy, this is where the likelihood of employee engagement increases and where your people stay. We talked about people staying and being and employee retention. We know that companies with high performance cultures tend to be great places to work. And so it's also a place that works well, where employees are productive and motivated because they also have the resources they need to meet and exceed their goals. So they're not floundering because they feel frustrated because they can't get the work done because they don't have what they need. They feel supported by their management, not just their manager, but the management itself. And they feel aligned with company goals, back to that individual purpose. And they feel favorably about corporate leadership. They like the people, they like where they work, and they like the people they work with. And so a high performance culture is really about management style and strategy. It's about task distribution and assignments. It's about systems of accountability, and we're going to talk more about that too, as well as cooperation and help and support. How do all of those things work for you? Which ties to trust. Trust is the cornerstone, and it's a cornerstone of everyone's culture, and it's a huge component of a high performance culture itself. You can't have high performing teams if there's not trust. And so in high performing teams, there's a focus on the team over the individual. And again, they're composed or comprised of diverse members who have shared goals and a clear direction, and it allows for healthy conflict. And we're not going to talk about team conflict today, but understanding that some conflict is good. It just can't be a conflict that stops you from being successful. As part of that, high performing teams recognize the importance of rewards and recognition. You know, at our organization, it's simply a matter of when we've had a good event or we've had something good that we've all done and worked together on, we go out to lunch. That's kind of our thing. Everybody here really likes to eat, and having that social activity of going out to lunch is important. We've been not necessarily going out to lunch so much as having lunch catered in, but this idea that, what kinds of rewards and recognition works for your organization and the people on your teams. Um, and so you need to celebrate both individual and group wins. There's lots of studies out there that show that in a high performance culture that you're more profitable. And so why do you want to have a good culture? Why do you want to invest in this? Because you're going to make more money. And so when your employees are equipped to handle the tasks of their job, and again, they have that skills, knowledge, support, and resources and motivation to do the job, they're going to do their job better, and you're going to be more profitable. Back to this idea of innovation, you need to encourage idea generation. And so due to the trust and respect inherent in high performance cultures, employees feel empowered to take part in the decision-making processes and to freely contribute ideas and to share feedback. And we'll talk about what that looks like on both ends of the spectrum. We've mentioned that experience, high performance cultures, whether they're strong cultures or adaptive cultures, whatever they are, they experience less employee turnover. And so they feel like you have more employee well-being, that there's better communication, you've got trust, you've got alignment and support. And there's an emphasis on development, which means that you feel like you're growing while you're at that company. You've got a place to go. It means that you're less likely to leave that organization, which means it's going to drive engagement and retention. And there's a lot of numbers out there about how much it costs your company every time someone leaves. So when you're considering that cost with the cost to do things to improve your culture, I think it's not a hard sell. You need to make communication a trust. You need to make communication a must. You need to clearly articulate your expectations, and you're going to hear that theme over and over again today. You need to understand your employees' career and development needs. So you can't engage them and you can't make sure that they're happy if you don't understand what it is they want. And this requires one-to-one meetings between managers and direct reports. So make sure that's part of how you operate as well, whether you're the direct report or the manager. Your company needs to set company values that matter and then embody them and make sure that those values are visible in messaging and everyday interactions. And we talked about that, I think last month when we talked about, your value chain and as well as that individual purpose where we talked about making sure that people feel that what they're doing is contributing to the company itself and supporting the company's values. You need to prioritize performance management. So I'm going back to understanding an employee's career and development goals. You need to prioritize performance management. You need to initiate employee development conversations and make sure you've got actionable feedback and make sure that all of your expectations are very clear. And this should be ongoing. When our organizational resilience series, we have a whole module on having an agile performance management system so that makes sure it's ongoing and not just something you're doing. You still need to do it on a regularly scheduled basis, but making sure it also is more informal as well. And so to do that, you need to have goals to keep your career development top of mind. So making sure that your people set meaningful goals and then helping your employees reach those goals is really important. So I would like to do a poll. We haven't done a lot of polls in recent months, but in this case, we're going to look at different cultures and we're going to have you kind of score your company and only score them high. So the ones that you feel like your company is doing a good job on, you can choose those. So you can choose all of them that apply. So how stable is your company and your culture? How attentive to details and innovative are they? How competitive and supportive are they? And what kind of orientation do they have, both team and outcome? So let me go ahead and launch this poll. And again, you can choose all of them. You can choose one of them. You can choose any of them where you feel that your organization is very strong on that. And I'm only going to give you like 10 seconds for these polls. So don't delay in responding. So right now, yeah, we need a few more people to respond. I'm going to give you a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And we're going with who's ever participated. So interestingly enough, the 72% of you feel that you've got some team and outcome oriented. And that kind of makes sense because everybody's working in teams and your team should have goals to work for. On the weak side, you feel like that you're less stable. And I think that's probably a pretty common response right now, given the fact that nothing in our lives is stable. We're not feeling very secure and we're not feeling like you've got a lot of predictability ahead of you. And then kind of in the middle is that attention to details and competitiveness in the marketplace, combined with being supportive. One of the challenges of these polls is you can only use a certain number of words, not even words, letters, and you can only have 5 options. So sometimes we have to combine those. So thank you for participating in that. I always love to do this, but we don't always have time, and I can't always figure out what to ask too, which is sometimes a challenge. So we're going to move next to this innovative culture. Everybody wants to be innovative. It's supposed to be a lot of fun to work someplace where there's an innovative culture. You see a tolerance for failure and a willingness to experiment. Who doesn't want to work under those conditions? They're also seen as places that are psychologically safe and highly collaborative and kind of flat, very non-hierarchical. Hierarchical. By the way, I want you to look at that dog on the right and see that she's actually got braids in her hair. I did miss that the first couple of times I've looked at this. You know, being innovative means, that you're on the cutting edge. But the problem is that creativity can be messy. And so it needs to be balanced by discipline and management. So we're going to talk about these paradoxes that are created in an innovative culture and the fact that you need to manage these tensions between these two sides. Otherwise, your innovative culture is going to fail. So let's talk about, I'm just going to briefly share those paradoxes and then we're going to talk about each one of those. So a tolerance for failure requires your company to have an intolerance for incompetence. You can fail, but you can't fail because you're incompetent. A willingness to experiment also requires rigorous discipline. So there needs to be some sort of discipline in how you're doing those experiments. And this is the one I find the most paradoxical, and I think it's the biggest challenge that I might personally have, is having a psychological safety, but also being okay with brutal candor. And so I tend to be a real direct person, and oftentimes my biggest concern is that I've said something that offends someone, and that is something that they can't take in a manner that it's meant to be, or maybe I'm not even considering feelings about it. I'm just being real direct because we're trying to move forward on a project. And so balancing those can be a challenge. I know that people who work in teams sometimes feel frustrated because there's no individual accountability. And so this collaborative activity needs to be balanced with individual accountability. And a flat corporate structure or even a flat cultural structure requires strong leadership. And so these tensions that are created need to be carefully managed because otherwise your innovative culture is going to fail and it's going to impact your company overall. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these. I loved these two pictures, where you've got, I have lots of paper crumpled up. In fact, I don't even crumple it anymore because if you're recycling, you have to uncrumple it, but it does go into the trash. But at some point, you're successful. And understanding that a tolerance for failure is not tolerance for incompetence. And so if you look at the second picture here where somebody's been trying to hammer a nail, you can see that they've been very successful and they finally got that nail in. Yeah, the nail's in, but they've destroyed the wood surface. So what good is that? And so you can't, while you can have a tolerance for failure, you can't have a tolerance for incompetence. So that means you need to hire extremely competent people. And so this goes back to your HR and your hiring practices about who it is that you're hiring. And so this requires senior leadership also to clearly articulate the difference between productive and unproductive failures. And one of the ways that you can do that is to look at the cost of the failure itself. So, and if, and the cost to time as well as money, as well as to your resources. And having that articulated is really helpful. And having a culture of competence also requires those clearly articulated expected standards of performance. You've got your competent people, but this is what I expect you to accomplish. So back to those performance evaluations and those communications that need to be happening regularly and very clearly. And so what are the expectations? And sometimes those standards of expectations performance are going to change because of changing circumstances. So when you have change, you need to be really clear on what those changes mean, because maintaining that healthy balance between tolerating productive failures and rooting out incompetence is not easy. And I think that is a huge, huge challenge for most people. Is what is the cause of that failure? Because everyone makes mistakes. We all do. But at what point do you cause kind of that forgiveness for the mistake slide into permissiveness where you're just accepting things that you shouldn't? And so we know that if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything. But striking that balance is hard because the causes of the failure is not always clear. And this cliche of celebrating failure really misses the point. We should be celebrating the learning from our failure, not the failure itself. It's a really a small thing, but that perspective is important. And then understanding, at what point does setting high performance standards devolve into being cruel or failing to treat employees regardless of their performance with respect and dignity? And so you need to have high standards. You need to have competent people. You need to allow them to fail, and you need to treat them with respect and dignity. This is not easy. This is hard, and it's hard to do it consistently, especially when you're tired, especially when you're overworked and you have a lot of change in your life and in your work life that is making it harder for you to be flexible and to be kinder. I'll even just say it that way. Maybe patient is a better word. So you also, when we're looking at the paradox of a willingness to experiment, but you need to be disciplined. And I love that picture on the right, by the way. And I know that, throwing paint on a canvas is a thing, but I don't know if it's a thing that your company really wants to do when they're spending money on experimenting on something and trying to be innovative in what they're doing. So organizations that embrace experimentation need to be comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. And I can tell you, there's a lot of people I know that are not comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, so that you probably don't want to be in a job that requires you to be innovative. You might want to be in a job that requires something that's more stable and where you're doing similar things. Um, but you can't always know all the answers up front or be able to analyze what's going to happen. And so sometimes what's important in an innovative culture is this idea that you're experimenting to learn rather than to produce an immediately marketable product or service. And so sometimes your experiment is really one of learning and trying to understand what's the best way to go forward. And so you have to have a discipline-oriented culture in order to do that, so that you're selecting experiments carefully on the basis of their potential learning value. And then design them rigorously to yield as much information as possible relative to the costs. And so to do that, you need to establish clear criteria at the outset. So what's your criteria for deciding whether to move forward with or modify or kill an idea? If you've got a very defined criteria for when you kill things, it really makes it less risky to try new things. So putting that discipline in with that criteria is going to help you to be more innovative. And you should expect your teams to design killer experiments. So, and those experiments need to maximize the probability of exposing an idea's flaws. And so here is where, when you're putting out those experiments, you're trying to, one of the goals is not only to learn, but expose where it's going to go wrong. And then finally, using a lean approach. So you've heard us talk a lot about agile and adaptive, and lean is part of that. And so trying to cycle through more ideas more quickly versus having something that's very long and drawn out with an ending that maybe doesn't even match what you started with. Because it makes it psychologically easier to walk away from projects that are going nowhere. Again, having that criteria becomes important. And it also forces your teams to focus narrowly on the most critical technical uncertainties and then give them faster feedback. So if you can expose those ideas' flaws as quickly as possible, you're going to have a leaner approach and your innovation is going to be less costly and less wasteful. So the philosophy is to learn what you've gotten wrong early and then move quickly in the more promising direction. And this is that balance between a willingness to experiment and being highly disciplined and how you do that. So here we move on to, and I love this picture, being psychologically safe but brutally candid, because psychological safety is an organizational climate in which individuals feel they can speak truthfully and openly about problems without fear of reprisal. And it's about more than that too. But this fear of reprisal is a big deal in a lot of companies, and you cannot be innovative if you're going to be fearful. They just don't work together. And so if people are afraid to criticize or openly challenge a superior's views, where are you going to go? Like, you're going to be back at that water cooler where you're kind of talking behind the water cooler behind closed doors and not speaking directly on things. And this is going to hurt your innovative culture. You need to be able to have a culture that allows you to debate the ideas of others, to raise counter perspectives. You really want to know. This is why having diverse teams becomes really important, because you need to have diversity in how people think so that you can raise these counter perspectives. And this is going to help you identify those flaws in your experiment as well. And if people are afraid to talk openly and speak openly and share their ideas, your innovation is truly crushed. But understanding that psychological safety is a two-way street. If it's safe for me to criticize your ideas, it's also needs to be safe for you to criticize mine. It has to go two ways. It can't just be the boss can criticize, but the employee or the team member can't. And so whether you're on a higher or lower part of the organization should not matter when you're having these candid conversations. However, this is easier said than done. If you look at the comforting lies line versus the unpleasant truth, absence of anybody over there, that is how we generally feel. Um, we need to have unvarnished candor because it's critical to innovation and it's the means by which ideas evolve and improve. But most people say our problem, we can't do that because we're an incredibly nice organization. Or, you don't want to look like you're not a team player. You can't, you don't want to go against the grain and say something that might not be considered well accepted. And so, sometimes it's just easier to tell comforting lies and go along with it. But that means that you're not going to be able to be as successful. And also understand that brutally honest organizations are not necessarily the most comfortable environments in which to work. And so you need to understand your own personality and how well you take criticism. I can sometimes take criticism really well, and other times I'm like, no, I don't want to hear it. Like, this is something I'm really, really feel is important, and you can't tell me that it isn't going to work or it doesn't have value. And so there's discomfort with that. And we know that some of the more um, innovative companies, you'll hear Apple, you'll hear Google, you'll hear a lot of these companies, um, you'll hear stories about people and say, I cannot believe how cruel, how can you work in that environment? And that's what's required in order to be innovative, in order for them to stay on top of what they're doing. Because when it comes to innovation, the candid organization is going to outperform the nice one every time. And so while we want to be nice, and we have to be here, I think the word nice is an interesting word. I think the word respectful is what's more important here. We need to be respectful in how we are brutally honest or brutally candid. And maybe the word brutally is the word here. We need to be respectfully candid and respectfully honest in order to be innovative without causing people psychological unsafety, or how they feel that they don't feel that they can be part of that group anymore. I did add a little bit more here because I loved this quote, and it is very aged, obviously, back to World War II. But in the United States, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's battle plan briefing to the top officers of the Allied forces just weeks before the invasion of Normandy, which obviously was successful, but it was very innovative from not just the US side, but from the UK side and other side as well. But he said, I consider it the duty of anyone who sees a flaw in this plan not to hesitate to say so. I have no sympathy with anyone, whatever his station or rank, who will not brook criticism. We are here to get the best possible results. And so Eisenhower was not just inviting criticism or asking for input, he was literally demanding it. And also invoking another sacred aspect of military culture, which is duty. So when you're looking at the culture of your organization, it is your duty to say something if you see a flaw in a plan, and to listen if somebody says something to you that exposes a flaw in a plan, because everybody's there to get the best results. And so I want to challenge you today with, if you do nothing else today, I want you to consider how often you demand criticism of your ideas from your direct reports, from your team members, how often you demand it. Number one, I think sometimes it's hard enough just to accept it, just to listen to somebody that's got it. But how often do you actually open yourself up to asking people and demanding people to say something um, about any flaw, instead of just going along or quietly subterfuging or undermining? I put the two words together, undermining what it is that you're doing versus just coming out and telling you. And this is going to be really reflective in the culture, because every one of us has an impact on our company's culture and our team's culture. And we really need to be aware of our impact to that. So our next paradox is really collaboration, but having individual accountability. And I remember my kids when they were in middle school and high school, just struggling with having to collaborate. If I just could do this project myself, they were much more about just doing it on their own than working in a team. And then there's others where I'm just like, I love being in a team. This is great. I don't have to do anything. I can just be there and hang out and I get the same grade. And so this paradox of the two of them really need to work together. People who work in a collaborative culture view seeking help from colleagues as a natural thing, regardless of whether providing such help is within their colleagues' formal job descriptions. And so collaboration is huge. It's a behavior that's that needs to be very evident in more resilient organizations, but it comes with that idea of an individual accountability as well. You need to have the balance between the two. An accountability culture is one where individuals are expected to make decisions and then own the consequences. I'm sure you know people that can't make a decision, and it's that fear of individual accountability, that they're afraid that kind of the buck stops here piece. But we all need to have individual accountability, and we can do that by collaborating better as well. That collaboration itself are complementary, and collaboration drives accountability, and accountability drives collaboration. They work hand in hand, even though they seem to be a paradox. And you've heard me talk over and over, and you've heard everything that we teach about talks about being as flat a structure as you can in your organization, getting rid of that middle, that kind of, that whole bureaucracy that kind of clogs things up. But if you're going to have a flat structure, you need to have strong leaders. And again, that seems like a paradox, because in a culturally flat or structurally flat organization, people are given wide latitude to take actions and to make decisions and to voice their opinions. And deference is granted on the basis of competence, not your job title. And we also know that flat organizations can typically respond more quickly to changing circumstances. And we see this a lot in the crisis management space, where the flatter that is, the better they're able to operate. And this is because decision making is more decentralized and it's closer to the sources of the actual information itself. And they tend to generate richer diversity of ideas than hierarchical ones. And this is because they can tap into the knowledge, expertise, and perspectives of that broader community of contributors. However, on the other side of the coin, flat organizations require stronger leadership than hierarchical ones. Flatter organizations often devolve into chaos when leadership fails to set clear strategic priorities and directions. So back to what we talked about at the very beginning is strong leadership needs to set clear strategic priorities and directions, especially under changing circumstances. Otherwise, you're going to have chaos. And flatness does not mean that the senior leaders distance themselves from operational details or projects. In fact, flatness is supposed to allow leaders to be closer to the action. And so, really, a benefit of this, when you have a flatter organization, it requires employees to develop your own strong leadership capacities and capabilities and to be comfortable with taking action and being accountable for your decisions. And so it allows you to grow within the organization as well. And this is something that I think the companies really need to be thinking about is you want to grow your leaders every day. You don't want those leaders walking out the door. They get the experience they need and they're out. You want them to stay. So we're back to that employee wellness and being feeling like they're part of the organization and contributing and where their individual purpose is aligned to the corporate purpose and feeling like they're accountable for their decisions and being part of the whole team becomes really, really important so that you don't lose your people. But an innovative culture is not all fun and games. Um, it's difficult. And because we see that it requires a combination of seemingly contradictory behaviors, there can be a lot of risk in creating confusion. So, if you have a major project and it fails, should you celebrate? Should the leader of the program be held accountable? So, are you celebrating or are you really saying, hey, this was your fault? And this is going to depend on the circumstances themselves. So, answering questions like, was the failure preventable? Were issues known in advance that could have led to different choices? So, here's where you get down to making sure that your team is operating effectively and that your experiment is innovative, but it also has discipline. Was there valuable learning from the experience? Were your team members transparent as they were going through? What did your communication look like? This is all part of deciding whether or not the failure was actually okay. Because while certain behaviors are required for innovative cultures are relatively easy to embrace, others are going to be somewhat less palatable. Going back to when I talked about being brutally candid or brutally honest or whatever the words you want to use there, it's not always easy for everyone. And so understanding, who you are and how you operate and where you want to be as part of the innovation within your company is going to be really important for that to work. Because innovative cultures can be unstable. And the tension between those counterbalancing forces can easily be thrown out of whack. And that's where you have your chaos. And so leaders really need to be vigilant for signs of excess in any area and then intervene to restore balance when necessary. So let's take our next poll, which is looking at your innovative culture assessment. How innovative are you? What's your tolerance for failure? What's your willingness to experiment? How psychologically safe do you feel? How collaborative are you aligned with that individual accountability? And what does your structure look like compared to your strong leadership? So I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close this. And these are really interesting results. So the 82% is huge, collaborative with individual accountability. And this goes back to the fact that I'm assuming that many of you or most of you are working in teams. And the other three of those are pretty much evenly split. But here is where that psychologically safe and being brutally candid thing is hard. That's why I mentioned it too, because my assumption is I wasn't the only one that felt that this is hard. And it's a hard thing to manage and to be respectful of and to be open and not hurt people's feelings. And that's why we see that line in having those nice, happy lies going forward to you. So thank you for sharing. I want to just share this graphic. This is from an organization in the UK, and they are a consulting company that does work on adaptive cultures. But what I thought was really interesting was that a lot of their guiding principles were very similar to what we're seeing in ICOR's resilience framework, for example. And they've got these things that they're calling enabling rules, which ICOR talks about the behaviors and your capabilities. But really, those rules are your behaviors for how you operate, and that is tied to your culture. And then that corporate citizenship, looking at who you are and what you do and how you're aligned to what your organization does. So this is just something I shared. I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but if that's something you want to learn more about, the references there too. And so one of the things that MIT put out as part of their Sloan review was 7 elements of an adaptive culture. And this is pretty recently published, and it's, during COVID published. And its focus is on why every executive should be focusing on culture change now. And nobody wants to hear about culture change because change, none of us even wants to hear the word change anymore. But the fact is that because of all the changes that are happening and have been happening and that will continue to happen, you may need to be looking at your culture and to see if your culture is still aligned and still supporting what you're doing, because we remember a healthy culture makes, increases your performance. So leaders must lay the foundation for their organizations to thrive in a very different world. So to make transformation a reality in their businesses post-pandemic, leaders really need to build a strong culture to support it. And the time is now, like you can't really wait. So the 3 of the biggest changes that they're seeing that are linked with transformation that have been affecting everybody is the adoption of digital technologies, the development of new business models, and the implementation of new ways of working. And those of you that have adopted digital technologies before the pandemic are in a much better place than those that hadn't. And those of you that have been, having various ways to work before the pandemic are not in as much stress and anxiety of those that didn't. And so the amount of change that organizations have felt has changed based on, kind of where they were in this space ahead of time. But we know that most organizations are now engaged in one or more of these types of transformation because they have to. It's not a choice. Because if you're not, you risk becoming obsolete. You don't have a choice. If you have ignored the signals that have been coming, or you haven't been able to adapt quickly enough, your organization is going to suffer. And this goes really back to the people. You need to have people that can adapt to change as well, which is really what is informing our webinars for next year, is how to make people stronger and healthier, and so that they can be better people for your organization as well as individually. And so the 7 elements, and some of these should not seem strange to, if you work in any sort of agile environment, you're looking at your customer and prioritizing the needs of customers rather than on products or profit. We understanding that you need to have an ecosystem focus, that we're all part of the same world, and your company's part of a larger system within that world, and how does it fit into that? And this is where you see a lot of sustainability initiatives, for example. If you haven't heard me talk about analytics in the past, excuse me, you have not been listening. You need to have an analytical orientation. We need to fully embrace the power of data and analytics in all of your decision making versus relying only on experience or judgment. Obviously, experience and judgment have a role, and that experience and judgment have a role also in how you analyze your data. But you need to have this happening. And if you're not using data in all parts of what you're doing, you're not going to be as successful. We've talked about collaboration, having not just your collaboration within teams, but having cross-organizational collaboration and teamwork rather than working in these silos, which is really how ICOR got started, was to try to break down some of those silos with managing risks specifically. You need to take a bias to action. So here is where we're talking agile again, valuing your speed over perfection, and not minimizing risk. Not your whole focus shouldn't be on risk it's another hard word to say, minimization, but taking that bias to action. You've heard us talk a lot about having that learning mindset that allows you to engage in experimentation as well as rapid learning, and making sure that your leaders are enablers and empowering and energizing people while also holding them accountable, which you've heard before. So these are considered kind of those elements of an adaptive, and again, agile and adaptive correlate very well together. So let's do our third survey and really look at um, how you score on the adaptive side. Are you more customer centric versus product centric? Are you um, are you using decision making? Is it informed by analytics versus judgment? Is your Do you have lateral collaboration, or is your in teamwork versus more of a vertical? Do you use experimental and learning versus planning and execution? And do you have coaching and empowerment versus more direction and oversight? And I'll give you about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it up. This is interesting as well. So it is really good to see that 83% of you are having decision making informed by analytics, that you're looking at having a customer centric approach. And then following that, you again seeing more teamwork. That's been part of the process. And really the lowest part is on that experimental learning and focus versus planning and execution. And that might depend on what your company does as well. If you're producing a product versus selling a service. But I'll argue that your services that you're providing, you need to use experiments on how you provide those services as well. But interesting. Thank you for sharing. So to close up for today, we're going to talk about a resilient culture. And I just want to set the premise, and I'm going to summarize this as well, that kind of the resilient culture is summarizing everything that we've currently said, just putting it at a higher level right now. So we know that one of the most important factors driving organizational culture is strong leadership. You've heard me say that over and over again, and I'm sure it's not a surprise. We know that resilient cultures begin with engaged leaders that understand and support their employees. And a lack of senior leadership support creates risks of having that disengaged workforce, and therefore that contributes to having that weak company culture. And so to improve that, you need to make sure that your employees can directly interact with their managers. And this will create that strong link between employees and leaders, no matter if they work in the same office or if they're in a different time zone. Leaders of resilient cultures need to take personal responsibility for engaging effectively with their employees. And during transitional periods, they need to make the difficult decisions to protect their teams. And definitely, we've been in transitional periods, and you should probably have seen that the way you're leading and the way your leaders are leading you should have changed. If it hasn't changed at all, that would be interesting to understand how it's working. We've talked a lot about having communication and having transparency in your communication, because um, communication is a powerful tool to drive behavior. and and I'm going to talk more about communication because it is hugely important. But having ability to be transparent in your communications creates this idea of open conversations, and then you can also, be sharing this idea of ethics and values as well. And so it's the job of leaders, no matter where you are in the organization, to promote responsibility through this idea of open communication. You also need to provide safe and secure work communities in the social work environment. Um, the workplace can be a stressful and overwhelming place, especially when undergoing changes or disturbances. Some of you don't even know when you're going to go back to the office yet, if you haven't gone back already. And so we're being told, in the past, you need to separate your work from personal lives. You need to check your feelings at the door. Well, right now there's no door because we're all, you're working from home. And so that line between family and work is growing ever thinner. And so we need to make sure as a company that you are closing some of those gaps that we're now seeing with the social part of our jobs, because we need employees to connect and collaborate within professional communities. And so you need to give them a dedicated space to share their interests and create social connections with colleagues, this informal way of doing it. And here is where you really need to leverage HR to help you with that. We've talked a lot about knowledge management over the past year or two. Knowledge management is a key capability. It's not going away. It's a very important pillar in building a more resilient organization. And sometimes it's a reason why companies fail to successfully integrate their innovations is because they don't have a knowledge management system in place. And so there's tons of technology advances and opportunities for companies to leverage technology in order to design a more agile and open knowledge management system so that you have a way to cooperate and share information. All of these things, tied together. And we know that companies are becoming more and more complex. You're operating globally. You are, just the everyday challenges of globalization itself is complex. And so operating this way increases the level of complexity. And therefore, you have to increase cooperation and information sharing while at the same time establishing shared responsibilities across the whole team. And I loved this graphic about empower, teach, align, and mentor. Resilient cultures understand the benefits of shared responsibilities and empowered teams, and they can prepare organization employees for crisis situations, establishing a clear understanding and sense of responsibility. So let's take our last culture assessment. And I'm warning you because we added the polls, we probably will go about 5 minutes over, just to give you that warning ahead of time. So do your employees directly interact with managers? Do you see open communication and transparency that's driving behaviors? Do you have a social work environment that's safe and secure and a dedicated place to do that? Um, do you see agile and you have an agile and open management system that includes for innovation itself? And do you see shared responsibility and empowered teams with accountability? I would imagine from what I've seen you responding before that that's going to be one of the highest ones. But I would also hope to see that that your employees are directly interacting with managers. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds. And again, you can choose all that apply. All right, let's see our responses. So this is also really interesting. Just like that data one was good to see. Employees directly interacting with managers, which is fantastic. That is a huge enabler, followed by that shared responsibility and empowered teams. But interestingly, having that open communication and transparency driving behavior. So you're seeing interaction with the managers, but not necessarily as high a level with your open communication. So that's an interesting finding. So think about how you scored these. For each of these polls, think about how you scored them and why you scored them that way and what you can do about that. I wanted to share this graphic. It's sort of interesting. Essentially, this consulting company has what they do is they do surveys. And I really liked their resilient culture, and it's actually more of a resilient organization piece. It's very much aligned to what ICOR has for a resilient organization, where you're looking at your mission that's tied to your strategic direction, your goals and objectives, your vision, where you're looking at being consistent with your core values and everybody being in agreement and having coordination and integration, where you're looking at how people are involved and what that means for empowerment and team orientation and how you develop capabilities. And then looking at adaptability itself. How do you create and manage change? How do you have that customer focus and how do you manage organizational learning? And then tied to both that external and internal focus and being balanced by where you need to be flexible and where do you need to be stable, and all of that tied together by beliefs and assumptions. So the question I have for you is, how did the underlying culture of your organization influence its response to the pandemic? I think this is a big question for you to think about, and it should inform you on how to move forward a little bit. What they saw in the study that they did is that the top resilient scorers, people that were more resilient organizations, also had significantly higher culture scores. And so one of the things that they've said is if you want to make sure that your organization is ready to effectively and quickly adapt to a future crisis or disruption, you need to make sure that your culture is clear and aligned with your organization's mission and vision. And when you compare organizations' responses on the culture trait of adaptability to their response on the resilience assessment, what we saw is a very clear pattern. Adaptability and resilience go hand in hand. There were a couple of outliers that had average resilience scores, even though they were kind of low on their adaptability scores. But the fact is there weren't any organizations that had a high level of resilience without a strong culture of adaptability. So the foundation of resilience response to crisis is to have a strong underlying culture of adaptability, and organizations that have positive cultures seem to have the best response to that. So to summarize, in a post-pandemic world, you need to start listening to your people. I used to hate it when my kids would give me the hand because I would evidently lecture a bit much. So we need to listen. And it's going to be harder to listen and adapt to all the variety of support needs that people have if you have a top-down way of management. You need to not just bounce back, but you need to bounce forward because there really is no going backwards. We need to look at how are we going to survive in this new environment? And it might mean you need restructuring and transformation. It may be that you are well positioned already. What does your governance and coordination look like? Most of our traditional methods of managing and coordinating seem to have disappeared overnight in late March 2020. So what's been replacing them? And I don't mean just will, because I think we've been doing this. Nobody's just been sitting still. But the fact is that the systems that were designed over years to govern, coordinate, and make decisions may need to be replaced or supported by more virtual systems, because we used to have a lot more informal interaction. So back to one of those recommendations is you need to look at how to create an environment where people can interact virtually in a healthy way. Because if you're in a totally and virtually environment, all of those informal interactions are gone. The water cooler thing that I mentioned earlier. And your habits and routines have changed. Culture change occurs when the big picture priorities get aligned with the thousands of habits and routines that structure our everyday behavior. And how many of your habits have changed since March of 2020? How many more habits and routines will need to change as we work through the pandemic and all the changes of that and emerge into a new world on the other side, hopefully someday soon? And so aligning individual behaviors with organizational objectives always takes leadership, and this work is never done. It's something we have to continue with. So some lessons learned. An organization's culture makes a difference in how it adapts to a crisis. The number one theme in a study done by Forbes is that we need to feel that we're being understood and that you're supporting my work-life balance and that my voice is being heard. And the main thing that they want to know is we need to know more about what the future will hold. And guess what? So does everybody. We all are feeling that we don't know what's happening in the future. But you need to, even if you don't know for sure, you need to communicate. And this is really communicate, communicate, communicate. You need to not only message frequently, but you also need to create opportunities for yourself to listen. We need to bounce forward as well as bouncing back. We need to bounce back as well as bouncing forward, and continue to keep your employees engaged. You're going to need to redefine your work. If virtual work is your new norm, what do you need to change to make that happen? If it's been something you've been doing all along, how can you make it better? And just remember that culture comes first. Make sure that you understand how your current culture strengths are and what the areas where you could be clearer and more aligned. And with all of this changed, I don't think there's anyone that can say that there isn't an opportunity here to become better at this, because culture is reflected in the behavior of our leaders. And so working to intentionally align leadership behavior with these new objectives is really the important first step. So to summarize, there's no perfect culture. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. However, organizations that intentionally work to continuously improve their culture by incorporating attributes from strong, high-performing, innovative, adaptive, and resilience cultures are going to outperform those that are not. And organizations that implement these attributes are more likely to outperform those that don't, both during normal times as well as when responding to a crisis. I strongly recommend that you take a look at these references, and when you get your certificate, we will send you the references as well. There's quite a few of them that I could only hit the top on, and they're pretty decent. And just to remind you, registration is open for our webinars for next year, and we're going to be talking about all of these behaviors. Thank you for coming. We hope that you will take a look at our how we are measuring organizations' resilience and gain recognition for doing that. And join us. If there are any questions, I know it is 5 past the hour. I am willing to stay on and answer questions, or please feel free to email me, and you can use the education@theicor.org email there to ask your questions, and I will reply either by phone or email as well. Thank you for attending, and have a great, happy holidays at the end of the year, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year.